Good evening. I'm Todd Mayberry, the Executive Director of the San Francisco Historical Society, and I want to welcome you all to this evening's History Live presentation by Janice Ross, who will be sharing a talk on the Halprins in her work and research over many years. The Halprins, of course, not only in their own way, each of them redefined dance, but also the urban landscape of this great city of San Francisco. So this is just an incredibly rich topic, and I just so very much look forward to hearing more. I also want to thank our sponsors, Raider Galleries, and also our community partners, Museum of Performance and Design, for making this evening's event possible. And also thank you for everyone that has given a donation. Every dollar adds up to great programming like this and helping support the work that we need to do to be able to partner, collaborate, and bring outstanding speakers like Janice to programming like this. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Bill Edelman, who will introduce Janice. So enjoy the show, everyone.
I'm Professor William Edelman, Emeritus from the Stanford Theater Department, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce a close friend and a Stanford colleague tonight. And it's Janice Ross, Dr. Janice Ross, who will be giving a wonderful presentation on the Halprins. Janice has an incredible academic career. She has a master's and a PhD from Stanford, and her rigorous scholarship elevated the Stanford Dance Department, so it eventually became connected with the Drama Department. She's a specialist in Anna Halprin's and Lawrence Halprin's work, and the new book out that she was to present is absolutely stunning. So you're in for a real treat. One side note is that all the Halprin papers are located at the Museum of Performance and Design, and I've been encouraging a kind of collective combination between the Museum of Performance and Design and the Historical Society. Archives in use and presented by the specialist on the Halprins. I know that you'll enjoy it very much, and so I'd like to introduce Dr. Janice Ross, Stanford University.
Well, thank you so much to Todd, to Bill, the whole team at the San Francisco Historical Society, Matt, Alan, Lana, Kirsten at the Museum of Performance and Design. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share this information today. I'm sad that I'm doing it virtually. You should be delighted I'm doing it virtually because unfortunately I have COVID and you would not want to be in the same room with me this evening. So the artists that I'm going to be speaking about tonight, I argue, are architects of hidden histories of how dance really undergirds experience with some of the most iconic places in San Francisco. The artists who designed and animated the places I'm going to be talking about are much less well known than they should be. They are one of the most influential art couples in America, the avant-garde dancer and choreographer Anna Halprin and the celebrated landscape architect Lawrence Halprin. Although both of them worked internationally, I believe San Francisco is the greatest public theater of their work in the world. Across their long lives, Larry died at the age of 93 in 2009, and Anna lived until shortly before her 101st birthday, passing away in the spring of 2021. Together, they made San Francisco a site for enriching lives through their focus on the flow of people through public spaces. The Halprins believe that engaging citizens with process, not just the finished product of environmental design or dance, energized them, elicited their untapped creative energies and resources, and finally built much stronger, more cohesive communities. Both artists responded with a unique focus to the Bay Area. There was the raw beauty of the natural landscape and its built environments, and they used movement, whether it be dance or an amble through a public park, to awaken people to participation in civic life. Now, I've studied and written about the Halprins' work for years, and this material I'm sharing with you this evening is drawn in part from my newest book, The Choreography of Environments, where, in the wake of the passing of both of them, I explore the spaces that shaped them as artists. In particular, their compact mid-century modern home in Marin County. And I explore what I call the lessons it imparted to how they shaped public space for all of us. Now, many of you have likely passed through these spaces, all of which I will reference in different ways this evening. And each of them was memorialized by the Halprin's sense of design and sense of orchestrating events. These include St. Francis Square, Ghirardelli Plaza, Embarcadero Plaza and Fountain, UN Plaza, Levi's Plaza, Stern Grove, Letterman Digital Arts Center in the Presidio, Market Street, Civic Center, the San Francisco Hilton, San Francisco Airport, and the Haight-Ashbury. You probably didn't realize that every time you visit one of these spaces, you are part of a performance or its legacy, a choreographed little civic awakening. Spaces and the structures and the objects in them can be secret dance scores. They direct actions, they contour the rhythm of how we move through a room, a garden, a plaza, or a city, and they feed into the harmony or friction we feel with others. Now, our story actually begins here on Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in August of 1945. Larry is a recent graduate of Harvard's program in landscape architecture, and he had enlisted in the Navy 2 years earlier. Suddenly, he finds himself an injured officer recovering on shore leave after the naval destroyer on which he was stationed in the Pacific was torpedoed. Anna, newly married to Larry, had just arrived a few months earlier from performing on Broadway, and together they're living in one of these spare Quonset huts that have been hastily erected on the grounds of the shipyard. For several months, these huts functioned as housing for non-active military personnel, enlisted men like Larry, who were temporarily out on survivor's leave and expecting to return to active duty shortly. Larry sketched the whole time he was in the Navy. This is a pencil sketch he made of a battle when they were stationed off of a Japanese island. And he actually salvaged his sketches by happenstance because he threw a bundle of letters, including sketches destined for Anna, to a passing ship. That was shortly before his ship was torpedoed and everything on it was destroyed. So the letters and sketches made it to safety. But I think it shows the active artist, the way he processed experience already by metabolizing it as a visual impact on him. At 4 p.m., the afternoon of August 14th, word finally reached the West Coast that the Japanese government had surrendered 6 days after the dropping of the second atomic bomb on Japan. As news spread, Anna and Larry climbed to a hilltop on the naval base to watch as the entire city exploded in a massive and spontaneous celebration of the end of World War II. We were all without words, Anna said, recalling that strangers were embracing one another and crying with relief and happiness. She and Larry watched fireboats spraying water in the fading light, and later that evening they saw cascades of flares and fireworks exploding over the bay. Off the base, San Franciscans celebrated the war's end wildly. In just the first 12 hours of victory celebrations, the Chronicle reported 6 local people died, hundreds were injured, autos were stolen, burned, or wrecked, and scores of streetcars had their windows smashed by exuberant revelers. Not just the violence, but the scale of the festivities was unprecedented. And this is an image here of the intersection, a major intersection of Market Street, what that August afternoon into the evening looked like. San Franciscans had not felt quite as celebratory up until this moment because enlisted men and women continued to be sent out from Bay Area naval bases into the Pacific Theater. Now, however, they were finally ready, and they continued celebrating in the streets for the next 2 days as roaming crowds of sailors and civilians looted and smashed windows along several blocks of Market Street. Spontaneously, the streets had become stages for broad social actions, spaces for performing euphoria as well as anarchy. For a choreographer and landscape architect on the dawn of their professional careers, these responses to VJ Day must have seemed like an inauguration of the performance potential of the city itself. Its public open spaces, its geography, its buildings, all revealed themselves as potential players and material for art making. In the decades ahead, these aspects of the city would become elements of a new theater of urban space for both Halprins, pictured here in the early 1950s. Now, by 1951, the Halprins had discovered and fell in love with Marin County across the bay. Purchasing a 3-acre lot on the side of Mount Tamalpais, they commissioned this redwood and glass modernist home from leading Bay Area architect William Worcester. And this really became the laboratory for the next 70 years of art invention for both Halprins. In 1954, 3 years later, this outdoor dance studio called the Dance Deck was added for Anna. It was placed 50 feet below the house, and it allowed her to inhabit a hyphenated identity between being an artist down the hill and a typical suburban post-war housewife up the hill. She was able to care for the 2 Halprin daughters while they were young, while also pursuing her path-breaking art experiments down below. It was on this deck that she would create her most important works, choreographing on this platform suspended off the hillside of Mount Tamalpais and surrounded by a curtain of redwoods and madrone trees. Working in this space radically changed her perception of movement and performance in relation to the environment. And it's interesting because there's no other dance space in the world that's perforated by trees as the dance deck was when it was built. It's like an homage to the forest that was there first. I also think of it as the trees are already dancing on the deck as they puncture through its surface. And she's this little tiny figure in the midst of this really edge of the sublime landscape. It's as if the body's in a pas de deux with nature. The deck itself became a teacher, as this little clip I'm going to show you of a bit of performance footage from a work she made called Branch Dance illustrates.
We were total artists. We broke as many barriers as we possibly could. It was like we had to break the proscenium arch. We had to break the role of the dancer. We could speak, we could sing, we could create sculpture. You know, you can just find elements and you can scramble them any way you want. And there are endless possibilities. They're not necessarily cause and effect. They just happen to happen at the same time.
Now that sounds fairly kind of obvious when we hear about it in 2025, but that statement about movement in dance not necessarily being a consequence of cause and effect, just happening to occur at the same time, was a radical notion in the 50s. Merce Cunningham was working similarly to unhinge cause and effect, the neat tying together of meaning and narrative from movement. And Anna was pursuing the same radical agenda on the deck. But the first time she works with San Francisco as a location is this work, a comical work, created in 1951. It was a romp that she improvised at the Palace of Fine Arts in the Marina to a poem by James Broughton, who was a poet and filmmaker very active in the San Francisco Renaissance, which was a group of artists who were precursors to the Beats. I'd like you to watch, feel free to laugh, and then we'll talk about it a bit more. A tiny clip, but I think you get a bit of the flavor of the silliness of the body that she's inhabiting here. And the source of the humor is that her body is jerkily out of control, when of course it takes immense control to render the illusion of uncontrol when you're a dancer. We see Anna inhabiting her body almost as if she's surprised by the spasmodic actions of her limbs, as if some force other than herself were orchestrating its loony excesses. Effectively, she's layering two identities on her body at once. We note that there's a skillful dancer, but we smile at the character that she conjures of a princess who is, to use Broughton's term, just slightly addled. Anna reveals here a keen movement insight of knowing when to draw things out and when to deliver a physical punchline. She's mocking her character, but at the same time, she's also mocking the false monumentality of this fictional ruin of a Roman palace that Bernard Maybeck had created for the 1915 Pan-Pacific exhibition. From the start, the distinctive spaces of San Francisco captivated both Halprins. Within a year of their moving into their Worcester home, with its walls of windows like a series of frames to the outside, Anna made this work, People on a Slant. It would be her first site-specific outdoor piece in San Francisco. Like a city street scene glimpsed from an apartment window, People on a Slant is a snapshot of the labored walks of a trio as they negotiate a steep hillside outside the Union Street studio Halprin used prior to the construction of her dance deck. The dance features these three overly earnest oddballs, all struggling to remain vertical and resist gravity as they trudge up or downhill. As a dance, it's a slight work, but its interest lies in how it reveals Anna starting to train her choreographic eye to roam outside and reframe a distinctly San Francisco geographical feature, steep hills, and the accommodating moves they prompt for their choreographic potential. Larry was also expanding his horizons, moving from landscape design work for private homes into urban environments. Increasingly, he was focusing on shaping people's physical responses to public space through designs that were implicitly choreographic. Anna was working in the reverse. She began seeking out unusual urban spaces like this one here, which is a San Francisco airport hangar under construction. She was using spaces like this as improvisatory scores for dance, and this was probably the most riskiest, certainly the most illegal example of her site-specific improvisation, and it's the only one of this scale captured on film. And it proceeds in silence, but in the foreground are Anna and a group of her dancers. They just scaled the fence on the weekend. They're trespassing. It's littered with glass and broken shards of construction debris. They're all barefoot, and they're about to dash toward the structure and do an improvisatory dance that responds to the architectural angles of this hangar. So I'd like you to watch, and then we'll talk a bit afterward. It's quite beautiful, the drama, I think, of the softness of these bodies against the hard angularity of the form. And it does allow you to pause your concern for a minute, like how did they get up there and how are they going to get down safely, and just admire the beauty. The photographer slash filmmaker she enlisted had access actually to an airplane, and he did a flyby the next day and was able to shoot from the air. And underneath here, the grid of the structure. The dancers weren't there the second day, and then he blended the films. He worked for Bechtel Corporation, so he was adept at filming construction sites. Anna's the short-haired figure here in the middle. There's a simplicity to how the architectural grid here frames the dancers' bodies in the air, as far in the distance San Francisco Bay shimmers. There's a clean abstraction of these images. However, it conceals a different story. Simone Forti, one of the original performers, told me years later when I asked her about what it was like improvising that afternoon, how much she hated every moment. I was so uncomfortable on those I-beams, she said. I remember feeling how incredibly dangerous it was. And indeed, it is visual images, not the physical reality of the dancers, that's documented here. They really make themselves subservient to the environment. It's like a little lesson all that work on the dance deck carries forward into the world outside. Anna would eventually shift to make the inner experience of dancers much more prominent, and she moved away from this kind of visual formality in subsequent years. But it stands, I think, as emblematic of the kinds of risks that she was willing to take, and I think the kinds of risks being a lone renegade artist in San Francisco in the 50s allowed her to undertake. Now, just as Anna was shaping art atop construction sites, Larry found himself drawn toward reconstruction when in 1962 he was recruited to work on this San Francisco landmark, what was then the abandoned Ghirardelli chocolate factory. The old brick structure of the factory was at risk of being torn down, and there were plans to build condominiums on this waterfront site. San Francisco developer William Roth wanted to save it, to preserve and recycle the 19th century brick buildings. So he bought it together with his mother, heiress to the Matson shipping line. And Roth asked Larry, along with architects Worcester, Bernardi, and Emmons, for their ideas about how this large site might be developed, using a new model for redevelopment that didn't simply raze everything and start over. With Larry as the designer for the outdoor spaces, the team created a plan that balanced historic preservation paired with renovation, an arrangement that would become a new model called urban renewal and the first major readaptive use project in the US. When it was finished, Larry had turned a visit to Ghirardelli into a trip to an old European city. He recreated a series of courtyards, plazas, arcades, and meandering walkways. He played choreographically with the space, prompting participation by discreetly contouring visitors' routes through ramped and winding stairways, across intimate brick courtyards, past fountains and places for outdoor snacking or congregating, and onto tiered balconies that beckon with expansive views of the bay, Alcatraz, and Aquatic Park. Ghirardelli has been lauded as one of the finest examples of creating space as theater because of how it elicits sensory engagement and active participation from performers and visitors. It turns shopping into an aesthetic adventure. Here is Larry now in a short clip talking about the project and how he rescued its most iconic feature, the lighted Ghirardelli sign.
The only problem there was the neighborhood because it's at the foot of Pacific Heights. They were a little concerned about it because it was going to introduce something vibrant. They weren't sure about it. The main thing I had to do, which I agreed to do, they wanted me to take down the sign that said Ghirardelli, a lovely old sign. And I refused, and they said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, well, I'll just turn it backwards. So instead of it shining in your eyes, it'll just be there, but it won't be lit at night. So, oh, fine. So we kept that too.
So I love that. The Pacific Heights folks, it used to face toward them, and he just flipped it and preserved it. It's now such an iconic image in San Francisco. San Francisco's dueling identities in the 60s as a convention center for mainstream business gatherings, but also ground zero for counterculture antics, collided in this work made by Anna called Lunch. It's a cheeky performance she staged at the San Francisco Hilton. As she moved throughout the years from her house to her dance studio in the woods, she had begun exporting ordinary activities from the house down onto the deck and explored them for their art potential. Routine things like bathing, like dressing and undressing, and like eating. So in 1968, when a group of 800 California Arts Council administrators were having a big meeting at the Hilton Hotel, they turned to Anna and asked if she and her dancers could provide some lunchtime entertainment. She cringed and then she accepted. She asked seemingly innocently, would it be okay if she and the dancers also were served lunch? The organizers agreed to what sounded like an innocent question. A raised platform with tables and chairs was placed in the center of the dining room. Before the room opened for lunch, the dancers wearing simple leotards seated themselves quietly at the table. And then as the lunch service began for the delegates, the dancers used that as their cue to begin eating, but at a glacial pace. In the lower photograph here, you see them raising a fork with a piece of salad to their mouths in an action that probably took 5 minutes. Similarly, drinking water in the upper photo could have been a 10-minute transfer from hand on the cup to up in the air to slowly toward the mouth. Meanwhile, the delegates were getting restless, looking around, asking when the dance performance was about to begin. And suddenly, word spread that it was already well underway. Anna was giving these arts experts a lesson in how art worked. Using satire and exaggeration, she was holding a mirror up to life by shifting attention at a business lunch from conversation to the usually secondary act of eating. And Larry here designed this wonderful score, basically roadmap for the dance, where there's a table, indications of gestures, actions, and sort of a schematic for what's to happen when. And these scores now designed by Larry are themselves works of art. Anna, though, really hit her stride as a dance renegade in the 60s when her anti-establishment dance works found an ideal environment in the Haight-Ashbury. She had opened up a secondary studio on Divisadero Street to use kind of for spillover performances and with larger groups than could be accommodated on the dance deck. The Haight then, of course, was the epicenter of the hippie and protest movements. And I share here with you a very brief clip of a work called The Bust. It was a street happening that evolved out of a composition class she was teaching at the Divisadero Street studio. On this occasion, she and a dozen dancers from what she called her multiracial company decided to take their improvisation onto the busy intersection of Divisadero and Haight Streets. Paul Ryan filmed the event, closely following the dancers, as several of the women skipped, crawled on all fours, and rolled across the crosswalks, bellowing, clawing at the air, swinging their limbs wildly, while the male dancers repeatedly scrambled to swaddle them in lengths of brown paper. Eventually, the San Francisco police show up, and Anna, who has been quietly observing from a distance, steps forward somewhat reluctantly and unconvincingly tries to explain that this is a reenactment of the medieval plague. But it's too late. The women are herded into the police car and taken to the station for booking. And probably, judging by the officer's expression, detoxing from behavior that just a few blocks away would have easily been categorized as a bad LSD trip. Here's a clip.
By that time, we were into the Vietnam War.
Who has the permit for these things?
The subject the students are working with was the medieval plague, which the student who did this composition felt is what's going on today, and it was like a theatrical protest against all the killings in the world today.
Now, this last clip here is from another work called Blank Placard Dance, part of this sort of whole period of Anna's protest work. Anna's the woman, proper looking in her 60s, white shirt, skirt, and sun hat. The man in front of her actually is John Rockwell, who for a number of years was the chief music critic and briefly dance critic at the New York Times. He was then a doctoral student at Berkeley and a dancer in Anna's works. And she is here protesting by assembling this line of dancers who walk from Civic Center to Market Street in a classic picket line of the area. The only problem is, what are they protesting? Because their placards are blank. And there are a number of explanations she gave. You project anything you want onto the placard and it becomes your protest. But my favorite is that you're protesting, which then becomes this sort of closed loop of critique. For the US bicentennial in 1976, Anna used the streets of San Francisco to celebrate patriotism now, rather than social criticism. A score map for the dance was created, detailing graphically how the entire city was to be turned into a stage. The dance began at sunrise at Twin Peaks, continued with hundreds of people dancing their way through the Mission, Market Street, and ending at sunset on the waterfront at Embarcadero Plaza, which Larry had designed along with commissioning the Villancourt Fountain. In City Dance, Anna claimed the entire city as her found stage for the day, and anyone who joined in the serpentining lines of performers moving through the city de facto became a fellow dancer. Hundreds of people answered the call to be both audience and performer in this 250th birthday gift to the city. And this is a brief clip of just a little of what the end celebration looked like at Embarcadero Plaza. You'll hear three different dancers who were drawn to San Francisco to work with Halprin, and there's a bit of the footage of City Dance mixed in here.
I think it was 1971, and I was so amazed to see her and to see what she was doing that I went back and I quit my job and I decided I was coming to California.
This is the movement I would like to start with to get going.
She was very, very gracious, and I went to her classes, but I did experience the terrible painfulness by going to those classes because I came in my little New York dancer's outfit with my leg warmers and my leotard and my tights, and they actually hooted at me, truly hooted at me in the dressing room.
I remember calling Anna Halprin because she was the most famous person around at the time, and I called her school and said, I'd like to know what your schedule is of your classes. And the person on the phone said, well, we don't, I mean, first of all, I'm coming from the East Coast, right? Are you from the East Coast? Okay, I'm coming from the East Coast to California, right? In 1960, in the 60s, it's like big change. So this woman on the phone says, well, we don't call them classes, we call them experiences. So I never went, and I never called her back. I mean, that just freaked me out completely. I had no idea what an experience was, and that's not what I was looking for.
Her notion of dance, if you want, or movement, was much more performance, was that everything you did was a performance. If you looked at, like, she talked about a score being like a grocery list. A list of things you wanted to buy at the grocery could be a score. It's like, that's the basic outline of what you're going to be doing. So your process of going and buying those groceries is the performance.
I want to get away from contraction and release. I want to get away from fall and recovery. I want to get away from this modern dance style. One of the first things I did was say, put your clothes on and start just a task. So we would carry lumber. We'd carry wood from the woods, and we'd carry it up here. And we noticed the movement of carrying lumber. We put it, we'll now carry a person from here to there. So we noticed the simplicity, direct approach.
In 1978, Larry debuted his poetic processional homage, in this instance, to the Gold Rush era history of the Levi Strauss family jeans. He was commissioned to develop the public areas outside of Levi Strauss's San Francisco headquarters. And he built a campus of grass, streams, and waterfalls at the edge of the city's waterfront. Larry's designs in Levi Plaza use water and landscape to tell the story of the Bavarian immigrant Levi Strauss and how he rose to prominence. During the California Gold Rush, Strauss ran a dry goods company in San Francisco, and he noticed that miners needed durable clothing. So he and a tailor used denim and copper rivulets to create the first blue jeans, which ultimately became an icon of American fashion. And I'll talk through Larry's design here and the way it has a narrative about Levi's as you're kind of watching. It's a beautiful sort of flow of water from immediately outside the front entrance to the headquarters, under Battery Street and across to this open grove and park in the street across. Larry's tribute to the miners begins at the front of Levi's headquarters, where he has a dramatic cluster of cement stairs and huge granite blocks here, washed by a roaring torrent of water. This is meant to be evocative of the headwaters of the Sierra waterfalls, feeding the mountain streams in which the 49ers panned for gold. Gradually, the waters subside and quietly meander through these pebble-filled rivers as they cross under Battery Street and then weave through these green rolling meadows on the park opposite the street. There are clusters of rock formations on the ground, like you would come upon in the wilderness. No park benches, instead you perch on them. And often they're filled with lunching or snacking office employees from the surrounding buildings. Using urban design, Larry is giving harried workers on a break the forced hush of a designed experience, taking them back to California's history and terrain. In the 1980s, as San Francisco became the epicenter for the AIDS epidemic, Anna began a pilot program exclusively for men and then eventually women who were HIV positive or who had AIDS or ARC. In weekly workshops, she worked therapeutically with her students using individual and group movement improvisations that allowed them to physically express their emotions from sorrow to anger to fear. By late 1989, these informal workshops had coalesced into two performing groups who often rehearsed at Fort Mason in San Francisco. There was a group of all men, they named themselves Positive Motion, and the group of women, they called themselves Women with Wings. Their work culminated in a range of public performances focused on their frank relationship to illness, including the major works Circle the Earth and Carry Me Home. San Francisco is now known internationally as home of the first AIDS dance troupe. The work speaks for itself, and so I share here two brief clips with you. The first of Positive Motion in rehearsal with Anna, and the second where you see her discussing the work, and it includes performance footage of Circle the Earth.
Fire. Fear in me. Virus on fire.
Talk about now.
Fire.
Let it go. Now experience. I gotta stop here for just a second. I'm sorry, because this is crucial. Again, it's not what it looks like. It's getting back to the emotional content. When they peaked with the music and then they stopped, you kept screaming. It was like your reaction to being heard. I want to be heard. And when you're over here, and Nico, you were really angry, and so your voice came out loud. Or you're talking to somebody way across that room, so your voice comes out loud, and I want to be heard, and I'm really angry. But then let it out. Or if you haven't, what's happening?
Part of it's just a transition. I mean, we begin to soften. People begin to touch me. I begin to touch them. And then the softening with me happens. I can't move into a softening when I've been, screaming about virus in my blood and then immediately go into kind of a soft. And so naturally, I think that feeling's going to continue some, but it's going to be brought down as I transition into.
But I think that if you had a chance to really get into it and release it, that something different's going to happen.
Here's the second clip, and you hear Anna here speaking about the work.
You can't try to make things not happen, even if they're unpleasant or even if they're life-threatening. You can't control that. But everybody can use art as a way to cope with whatever comes up for you.
I've been walking around, and all the people who are in my head, who are around me, are dead.
If you had the misfortune of being stricken with AIDS, the question that went in everybody's mind was, who's next? A cure is a medical intervention, but healing is becoming whole.
My name is Nick, and I want to live!
before I had cancer, I lived my life for my art. After I had cancer, I lived my art for my life.
You could hear Marianne, she said, before I had cancer, I lived my art for my life. After I had cancer, I lived my life for my art. So this sort of inversion of priority, but this tight symbiotic relationship between the two was a real constant. And that's Anna, of course, in the white dancing, this amazing energetic presence here. She's on the cusp of 70 when she did this piece. As they advanced into their 80s and 90s, both Halprins continued working in San Francisco, and their lessening interest in international travel turned into San Francisco's good fortune in being the beneficiary of their final projects. I conclude with two brief examples. In 2005, George Lucas commissioned Larry to design a 17-acre public park on the eastern edge of the Presidio in San Francisco. This would be Larry's last major new work. The site is home to the Lucasfilm companies. Although Lucas deflected attention from himself, naming it for the former military hospital that had been on the site, Letterman, he also personally paid Larry and gave the resulting park to the city. Larry shaped the site with groves of trees and rolling hills framing a rocky stream and winding path offering views of the Palace of Fine Arts and the marina below. He was recreating the pleasures of mountain hikes he remembered from California's Sierras that he used to take in earlier decades, and he was gifting them now to the city. And I'll show you just a brief clip with a voiceover of the kind of rhythms and music of the water.
At Letterman Digital Arts Center in San Francisco, the gradual audio stream is used to represent an ecological narrative. The sonic progression starts delicately, accelerates, and concludes with a triumphant splash. Halprin crafted the sounds to represent scenes in nature and to induce feelings of being in the wild. The soundscape evokes the ecological progression of water in the Sierras and produces a rare sonic sanctuary in the city.
In a poetic end to the decades of the Halprins' work in San Francisco, the final project they both worked on was the city's grandest and most beautiful theater in an outdoor setting, Stern Grove. In 1998, Larry and his colleagues were commissioned by Doug Goldman, president of the Stern Grove Association, to redesign the sloping meadow into an expanded theater. Goldman was the great-grandson of Rosalie Stern, the original donor of the property to San Francisco in 1931. She had intended it as a venue for free summer concerts in tribute to her late husband, Sigmund Stern. The result was a stunning amphitheater of grass terraces, stone retaining walls, and pathways woven into the natural setting that Larry shaped, echoing the original double Works Progress Administration, WPA concept. I wanted to create a mystical place, Larry said, where one would be inspired to reach into oneself. Landscapes are not complete, he insisted, without the people who bring them to life. This is the reopening of Stern Grove when 13,000 people brought it to life, inhabiting Larry's redesigned spaces, the grassy terraces. It's like an ancient amphitheater that flows down to the wooden stage. In many ways, it echoes the placement of the dance deck to the Halprin home and the privileging of environment and a fusion of the natural and the built. It I think really has both Halprin's imprint on it. Anna responded to this site with her own site-specific work called Spirit of Place, a dance that celebrates the ritualistic simplicity of Larry's design. Her dance premiered within months of Stern Grove's grand reopening in 2009. And in October of 2009, Larry passed away at his home in Kentfield at the age of 93. I share here with you a section of that dance in Stern Grove. Very simple, very modestly scaled contemplative work where the focus is kind of inward on each performer, understanding the task at hand, just a simple walk with hands before the face. But I think you're really drawn into it by their investment in the action. And I deliberately wanted you to see this portion where a guy walking his dog cruises through, a little child walks more sort of curiously toward them and points. That is all folded into both Halprin's experience of their art. They wanted the public participation. They wanted the engagement. Larry was initially battled by the dog walkers at Stern Grove who were worried the redesign would exclude them. And they were won over when he said, absolutely not. It's your space as much as the theater goers. And they became among his strongest advocates. So in conclusion, the Halprins loved urban and natural environments, and they brought the two together in San Francisco, a city that exemplifies an exquisitely calibrated balance between the two. The proximity of the city to their home in Marin meant that across both of their long lives, each time they returned to work in San Francisco, we are able to glimpse a different moment in their evolution as artists. Viewed together, as we have done this evening, their works illuminate three large lessons. One, art at its core is about creating experiences. Two, engagement happens through participation. And three, environmental sensitivity is modeled in cities and the built structures that choreograph our urban life daily. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janice, so much. That was wonderful. We've had questions coming in from our online audience, and I will attend to those first, and then we'll see what questions people have here in the room. So the first question I have is this. To your knowledge, was Anna Halprin or her dancers ever charged with a crime?
That's a great question. You mean dance and performance related, or just in there across the arc of their lives? I mean,
the speaker didn't specify.
Okay. No, it's a good question. There's a somewhat apocryphal story that when she performed her famous work that involves nudity, parades, and changes in New York at Hunter College in the mid 1960s, alerted that there was going to be full frontal nudity in the piece. The local police were kind of on standby. But what happened is the critics, at that point, Jack Anderson was the critic for the New York Times, and he told me the New York critics conspired to hold their review until after the final performance so that they wouldn't tip off that, in fact, the nudity had happened. So the story's gone forward that she was arrested. Anna always told me, no, she never was arrested, but she was at the threshold of arrest for that work. The bust clip I showed you there, the dancers are arrested. The footage goes on, and Anna says, where's the Presidio police station? I'll come and I'll bail them out, which she did. So at that point, the dancers took the hit for that. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thank you. Next question. Were the Halprin daughters artists, or did they go a different path in life?
It's a wonderful question, and I'm hoping actually one or both of them may be on the part of this evening online. They were both artists. They were both really wonderful artists, movement-based artists. Daria Halprin is still very active, a beautiful dancer. They both performed in Anna's work. Daria was a featured dancer in it. There was footage of her in certainly in Hangar that I showed. And she's a movement therapist, quite a highly reputed movement therapist. She continues to teach to the Tamalpa Institute, which she co-founded with Anna in Kentfield.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question from our online audience. Do you have any comments about the controversy over Ruth Asawa's mermaid sculpture in Ghirardelli Square and Lawrence's opposition to it? I'm especially curious about how that played out in the Halprin household.
That's a great question. I'm not privy to how it played out in the household. Larry was outspoken. He had intended it to be more of a natural fountain. And I think you've seen from the samples of his work that I showed, he was not a literalist. The idea of a very realistic, hyper-realistic mermaid fountain for him was kind of against the design he had in mind, this kind of natural environment. And I think he just, sucked it up, and the fountain now is quite popular and it remains there, but it's out of keeping, I think, with the style of his work at Ghirardelli Plaza. A kind of similar situation happened with the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C. Excuse me, a major work, probably the biggest culminating work of Larry's career, where he did not want to depict FDR in a wheelchair, honoring the fact that FDR spent his life kind of masking the fact that he was in a wheelchair. But public opinion was such that he had to add FDR in a wheelchair at the entrance to the exhibit, and to the memorial where it is today. And, he had to deal with those negotiations, but it's a little, it's a moment that's against his design aesthetic, like Ruth Asawa's mermaids.
Fascinating. Last question from our online audience is this. I wonder why Anna and her dancers never achieved the national and international notoriety and recognition of her contemporaries. Could you comment on this?
Yes, that's a very knowledgeable question. I think part of it is the obscurity of being on the West Coast. I think part of it is the nature of Anna's work. She was not someone who built what we call repertory, where she had a set group of 10 major works that she did over and over again or staged on other dancers. Parades and Changes is the closest that she came to that. It's not a work I showed you this evening. And I think also the fact that she was ahead of her time. I mean, she taught workshops where her students went back to the East Coast and they set in motion what became the impetus for postmodern dance. So I think the isolation of being on the West, the nature of her work is that she had a restless creativity where she kept moving on to new projects. And I will say, in her later decades, the world came to her doorstep. People began to realize the significance of her contribution. And there was really more and more and more requests internationally for her work, for permission to restage her dances, for exhibits of her photos and scores. So she lived long enough, I think, to go into a point of rediscovery.
Thank you. Now I'd like to open up questioning to the audience. We have about 10 people here in person. Does anyone here in the group have a question you'd like to ask? Anyone? Oh, Eric, yes?
Step over here.
Yes, come on over here.
Because the mic's to be right here.
Here,
I
why don't
can
you
hear
sit?
it.
Yes, why don't you sit here?
A live question right
Oh my goodness.
There you go.
No, I had some preconceived ideas of what this was going to be. I thought it was more about Lawrence Halprin and his impact in his architecture in the city. And I've learned so much more about Anna, which I appreciate. Was this going to be talk more about Anna initially? Was that the plan of the talk?
Yeah, I talked more about Anna. I think visually to be able to show dance gives the flavor of it. My background is as a performance scholar primarily, so Anna's work is the one that I know most deeply. But I very much tried to draw in and balance with Larry's work and to represent that. But I'm not an architectural historian. Are you in architecture?
No,
Landscape
I have an
architecture?
interest. I just have an interest in that. But it's more of an appreciation of Anna's work, and so in a way, I'm glad I'm in attendance to hear more about her impact in the performing arts in San Francisco. And one thing I really enjoyed going to was trolley dances. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, yes.
And I wonder if part of Anna's impact was how that became such a big focus in the annual trolley dances we had in San Francisco. Unfortunately, they ended that last year. Was their last performance,
Yeah.
and
I think
so. Do you know if there was influence of Anna's work in trolley dances?
I think it's a really lovely insight. And for folks who don't know, the trolley dances they were a group of San Francisco dance artists who did commissioned site-specific work around the city. And I think, yes, it seems to me that legacy of site-specific dance, you could draw a line back to Anna. Of course, it became much more widely popular in the 80s, 90s, into the present day. But I think she's a shadowy figure behind a lot of innovation in performance. No question.
Okay, great, thank you. Anyone else in the in-person audience have a question? Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to be closing the event this evening. First, I'd like to thank the Museum of Performance and Design for their collaboration on this presentation. And I'd also like to let you know that we will be having an exhibit about the Halprins planning for January 2026. So please stay tuned for that. I'd also like to tell you a little bit about next month's History Live. Although the museum is technically closed until early July, all of our regular presentations are still taking place here. And on May 13th, our guest speaker will be Lincoln Mitchell, who is a historian and an author, and his presentation will be about George Moscone and a recent book that Lincoln's just written about George. Moscone was a career politician who was, as we know, assassinated with Harvey Milk But there was much more to this influential and fascinating man's story. He was progressive and powerful state legislator who was instrumental in passing legislation on issues ranging from LGBT rights to funding for school lunches. After these accomplishments, he served as San Francisco's mayor at a key time in the city's history. So this will be a really fascinating topic and a chance to pester Lincoln Mitchell with questions. He knows a tremendous amount about this topic. So I hope to see you then. And thank you to everyone who joined in person and online. And thank you to Janice also.
Thank you very much.